The American Revolution was about much more than just throwing off a king, although that was pretty important. It was really built on a very radical idea, especially at the time, that the people, as the source of all sovereign power, have the right to resist and, in essence, nullify usurpations of power by any government. Usurpation meaning an exercise of power not delegated by the sovereign people to the government. So today we're going to do a deep dive into what turns out to be a secret weapon for liberty from the founders, because the government schools ignore this. And it's something they not only considered a right, but a duty. First of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, June 26th, 2024. And before kicking off all the historical awesomeness, I want to just take a quick moment to say one more huge thank you. I'll have more at the end. This week, we're commemorating our 18-year anniversary here at the 10th Amendment Center, and there's absolutely no way that the TAC could even exist without people like you being interested in our work, whether it's through podcasts or videos or articles or our activism efforts, and then helping us spread the word, whether it's through sharing things or being a financial supporter and the like. So I just want to say you have my deepest gratitude for being a part of this with me, whether this is your first day or you've been here for every single day since day one. But with that, let's get right to it. I want to kick it off with Luther Martin, here writing as Genuine Information in December of 1787. And he pointed out that by the principles of the American Revolution, arbitrary power may and ought to be resisted. Arbitrary power, of course, is an exercise of power that is on the whim of a government. This what they decide. It has nothing to do with the rules. In fact, they decide what the rules are. This is listed as one of the so-called grievances, one of the injuries and usurpations, technically, in the Declaration of Independence. And Martin says, this is the principles of the American Revolution. Arbitrary power may and ought to be resisted. And he said, even by arms, if necessary. Now, of course, that means resistance can take many forms, and it certainly did during the American Revolution. Those 15 years, the radical change in the viewpoints of the people from around 1760 through 1775, at the shot heard around the world before the actual war for independence, what John Adams later called the real American Revolution. Here's John Jay describing the American Revolution in various major stages of resistance. Resistance to what he called arbitrary domination. He said, "We resisted the Stamp Act with energy and success. We know that it was a people's nullification of the Stamp Act. And then in response, they passed the Declaratory Act, which claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever." So kind of a backhanded repeal. And John Jay discussed this as well. And when afterwards she claimed to bind us in all cases whatsoever, the same spirit of resistance animated our counsels and our conduct. When she recurred to arms to put a yoke upon us, we recurred to arms to keep it off. So for 10 years, we're talking 1765 and even earlier, they only took up arms at the end in response to arms being taken up against them. And we see that from John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson in their great document, passed declaring the causes why they were taking up arms, passed July 6, 1775. Maybe I'll cover that sometime soon again as well. Now, this right of resistance to usurpations of power is what James Madison called, quote, the fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared. There was no reason to declare independence if the government wasn't usurping power or responding in the right way when the people resisted and defied them. The fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared. And this is based on the political doctrine, according to James Madison, that the authority of constitutions over government and of the sovereignty of the people over constitutions, he said, are truths which are at all times necessary to be kept in mind, and at no time perhaps more necessary than at the present. So again, the authority of constitutions over governments and of the sovereignty, the final authority of the people over constitutions. This was the essential political doctrine to James Madison that made up the foundation of the American Revolution. James Wilson put it like this, just reiterating the same view during the ratification debates in 1787. He said, as our constitutions are superior to our legislatures, so the people are superior to our Constitution. So everything really starts from the people. It flows through the Constitution, and from the Constitution, that's a delegation of power to government. And they can only act as I've mentioned a few times recently, as an agent of the people. Now back to James Madison. This is in his report of 1800. He said, the fundamental principle of the Revolution was that the colonies were coordinate members with each other and with Great Britain of an empire united by a common executive sovereign, but not united by any common legislative sovereign. And he goes a little further. He said, a denial of these principles by Great Britain and the assertion of them by America produced the revolution. In other words, the far-off government, this is really just a precursor to the structure of power that they attempted to create under the Constitution for the United States and then the 10th Amendment. The far-off government has certain limited powers. They're delegated. The people are sovereign. Everything else is reserved to the colonies or to the states. Now, of course, they had an unwritten British Constitution, and that led to all kinds of arbitrary power. We have arbitrary power today, too, so a written Constitution in and of itself certainly doesn't do the job. That's why it's so essential for the people to resist and nullify usurpations of power, because words on paper don't enforce themselves. They never did, and they never will. So the colonies, according to James Madison, they reserved everything else that wasn't of a general nature. Very similar to what he said in Federalist 45 about his proposal for the Constitution, which is the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. We see the same principles in the American Revolution. And that brings us to the beginning of that resistance that John Jay was describing, the Stamp Act. Now, of course, we're going to go back a little bit further from this as well. But here's how Patrick Henry put in his great resolves, Virginia resolves against the Stamp Act. He said, the General Assembly of this colony, together with His Majesty or his substitutes, have in their representative capacity the only exclusive right and power to lay taxes and imposts upon the inhabitants of this colony. So Patrick Henry is like the original 10th Amendment guy if we're thinking about the principles that make it up. He's also one of the original nullifiers, as we'll see here in a moment, because he's saying, look, there's a line in the sand of what you're authorized to do. Now, he's specifically talking about taxation, but certainly this could be applied or would have been applied to other things. We'll see it applied on other things as well in just a moment. He said, every attempt to vest such power in any other person or persons, whatever, other than the General Assembly of the colony, then the General Assembly said, I should just read Patrick Henry's words, is illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust, and have a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American liberty. Again, there was no written constitution at that time, but he's saying, just under the system, you're not authorized to do this stuff. This is our reserve power. We have a right to local self-government here. We're not even represented in your parliament. So how can you make decisions for us? There is a line in the sand. And if you go beyond that line in the sand, it's automatically, in and of itself, it's illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust. We don't need to rely on you to declare that your act was unconstitutional. We're saying it right here in Virginia. He goes on, he says, His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. So when we hear about James Madison talking about fundamental principles of the Revolution, or Luther Martin saying by the principles of the Revolution, the people may and ought to resist usurpations of power, we can go back to Patrick Henry here in 1765, a 29-year-old man really laying this foundation like few others did that early on, that when they go beyond their limits, the people are not bound to obey them. In fact, that's what they're supposed to do. It's a duty as well, which we'll cover also as well. But he goes a little further. He makes it really hardcore. He said, any person who shall, by speaking or writing, assert or maintain that any person or persons other than the General Assembly of this colony have any right or power to impose or lay any taxation on the people here shall be deemed an enemy to this His Majesty's colony. So even just making the claim to Patrick Henry that the British Parliament had this power over internal policy in Virginia. He was saying you should be considered an enemy to the colony, because that is an enemy to the colony. This is about someone usurping power, or people usurping power and asserting authority over you that you have no control over. That is a total domination. And Patrick Henry was right. Now, in discussing, we can go a little further back. Now, in discussing James Otis Jr.'s, I think it's somewhere between 4 or 5 hour speech against the writs of assistance in 1761. And he's also, when he's going after the writs of assistance, he's also going against the acts of trade, like the Sugar Act, for example. John Adams pointed out this. Mr. Otis roundly asserted, this whole system of parliamentary regulations and every act of Parliament before quoted to be illegal, unconstitutional, tyrannical, null, and void. So soon as they go beyond an act of the what their limits are, James Otis Jr. specifically said an act against the Constitution is void. And John Adams, later in life, this is how he described it. All these regulations on trade that they were trying to push, the internal taxation, and then the writs of assistance, the general warrants to help enforce these trade acts and these taxation acts, were illegal, unconstitutional, tyrannical, null, and void. And in another letter discussing opposition specifically to the Sugar Act, John Adams described it like this. Mr. Otis asserted this to be a revenue law, a taxation law, an unconstitutional law, a law subversive of every end of society and government. It was null and void. It was a violation of all the charters and compacts with the colonies. Now, I'm not sure of which... Actually, I'm not 100% certain which act he's referencing here, but it's Statute 6G3C13. I believe it's the Sugar Act. I could be wrong on this, but it was one of the regulations that he was saying, this is not just regulation. This turns out, the way it plays out in practice, is it's an internal tax, and you don't have the authority to do this, and therefore, it's null and void. It's unconstitutional. So it's important to understand that as early as 1761, we're starting to see this type of view. Now, it wasn't just about asking this whole idea of saying, oh, this stuff is null and void. I've seen some people write about James Otis Jr. talking about this and saying in these various speeches and pamphlets that he wrote and the documents that he put together from 1761 through 1764 or 65 or so, even 1767, they were just saying that, oh, he's taking the position that it's null and void. So this is a precursor to just asserting that the courts should come in and say that it's null and void. Now, of course, he did say he was arguing in 61. He was arguing for a court to say this is unconstitutional, and he lost that. But he wasn't just saying that was the only recourse. The idea that the people should leave the fate of their liberty into the hands of people in government is totally wrong compared to what Otis was saying when the government violates the Constitution. And Adams described it like this. Mr. Otis roundly asserted that this statute and the preceding statutes never could be executed. The whole power of Great Britain would be ineffectual, and by a bold figure which will now be thought exaggeration, he declared that if the King of Great Britain in person were encamped on Boston Common at the head of 20,000 men, with all his navy on our coast, he would not be able to execute their laws. Why? They would be resisted or eluded. And we see this same type of mentality, resisting, eluding, and defying usurpations of power. Here's, for example, Jonathan Mayhew in a sermon that is titled now The Snare Broken. This is in May of 1766. He said, "It shall be taken for granted that this natural right is declared, affirmed, and secured to us, as we are British subjects by Magna Carta. All acts contrary to which are said to be ipso facto null and void." Now, we know that these principles weren't invented by James Otis Jr. or Patrick Henry or anyone at the time. There were many thinkers from the 17th and 18th centuries, the early 18th century, and even well before that heavily influenced these old revolutionaries. Here, for example, Algernon Sidney, who wrote Discourses Concerning Government in the late 17th century. They found it. He was, of course, attacking the idea of the divine right of kings, instead saying that the people were the fountain of all power, the people held sovereignty, and kings were just, they were just agents. And they found this manuscript in his home, and they put him to death for this. So he was considered a hero, a martyr for liberty, a hero to the American Revolution. He was cited by the revolutionaries many, many times. They all widely read his stuff. And here, for example, from his book, which was published after his death, "That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed." Now, you see how he's not just saying anyone is justified in resisting. He's saying it shouldn't be obeyed. In fact, if you do obey it, you're basically giving sanction to an unconstitutional act or a usurpation of power. We can also see a very similar approach from John Locke in his two treatises in 1689. He said, "When any one or more shall take upon them to make laws, whom the people have not appointed so to do, they make laws without authority, which the people are not therefore bound to obey." Again, we see the same type of mentality carried forward through the American Revolution. As long as they are enacting stuff they're not authorized to do, the people, by their very right, are not bound to obey. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just magically wave some document and say, "See, you've broken the rules. I'm not bound to obey you, and everything's going to be fine." Certainly, government power is a very dangerous thing. But here's Theophilus Parsons bringing the same mentality forward to the ratification debates over the Constitution in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He was a very powerful speaker. He wasn't Patrick Henry, but from my understanding, of course, I wasn't there and there's no recordings, but people would describe him as incredibly powerful as a speaking. In fact, there was one person who basically said, it doesn't matter what side you're on. Whatever side you're on in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention is guaranteed going to win. But here's how he put it. "An act of usurpation is not obligatory. It is not law, and any man may be justified in his resistance." And again, that resistance takes many forms. It can be from noncompliance to thwarting or evading, and then over time it can get much more serious, as we saw in 1775. Now, all of these original source documents, I might have another article or two and an episode to link as well. This will all be included in the show notes. We publish a blog post. Alan Mosley gets it organized. He organizes all the show links that I'm referencing so you can read in context and learn more on your own time. He also includes all the various platforms. We live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and X and LinkedIn and Twitch. We also live stream on other great platforms like rumble.com, which I love, and odyssey.com, which I love. I like seeing people, supporting the competition to these establishment teams. But we also have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. If we're missing from something, of course, we're on the mainstream ones, Spotify and Apple and elsewhere. But if we're missing from something, please let us know, whether it's email or otherwise, over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And while I'm taking just a quick moment, I want to say hello to everyone out in the live chat again. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for helping me commemorate our 18-year anniversary. I'm kind of blown away. When I first started this, my thought was, okay, we're going to reach a person or a handful of people. I'm just going to start doing some blogging. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to be doing this day in and day out, because it's what I love, what I believe in, it's what I'm passionate for, and I can't do it without you. So hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Brewster and Dennis and Gypsy over on Rumble. We also see Haji and Jules and Kirk and Cheriton and Chris, David, and Alan. Rights are not tradition, and a number of others over on YouTube, Loretta on Facebook, Senator DT, Howard, and others. Again, thank you all for being here. We're going to get this blog post published with all the reference links in there in a couple of hours after the live stream is done. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So we were talking about being justified in resistance to any usurpations of power, acts of arbitrary power listed in the Declaration as an injury or usurpation. These are the terms that the founding generation used. We've got John Locke, we've got Patrick Henry, we've got Algernon Sidney and Theophilus Parsons and James Madison and so many others. Luther Martin, of course, saying that this is how you have to do it under the Constitution as well. But it's not just a good idea. Let me get to this a little further. Here's Thomas Gordon writing in Cato's Letters number 42, an early 18th century, 1721, I believe. Let me see. Yeah, 1721. The violation of a law does not constitute a crime where the law is bad. So he's talking about how people have to disobey bad laws. And bad laws are those, well, first of all, you can have bad laws that are within the bounds of a constitution, bad policy. And James Madison specifically in Federalist 46 said a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union and disobedience by the people and the states' refusal to cooperate should be used even against warrantable acts, those are constitutional acts, that you consider bad policy. That's how you're supposed to deal with them. But of course, when they go beyond the limits, it's not even a decision about policy. It's like they're not authorized to do this, and that is acting like a tyrant. St. George Tucker said usurpations of power is an act of treason against the sovereignty, the final authority of the people. So Thomas Gordon has this same type of precursor. Of course, Cato's letters were just hugely popular amongst the American revolutionaries. The violation of law does not constitute a crime where the law is bad. Now, government might think it's a crime, and Theophilus Parsons, back to that quote from the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention where he said any man may be justified in its resistance, and he said, and they're going to get away with it too. They're going to get away with resisting because with using jury nullification, of course, this is my paraphrase, using jury nullification, his countrymen, those are the people in his state, will not convict him. So these are very important tools that we have to apply. Now, even Alexander Hamilton, a young Alexander Hamilton back in 1775, he got in on this as well. He said, in short, when human laws contradict or discountenance the means which are necessary to preserve the essential rights of any society, they defeat the proper end of all laws and so become null and void. Now, again, the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, and the people they learned from weren't saying it's only null and void when government determines that government's acts are null and void. It's the people declaring it because the people hold sovereignty, and it's up to the people to get that job done. And Hamilton even reiterated this before he flipped the switch here in Federalist number 33. I think he had already flipped because he was calling for unlimited power in the Philadelphia Convention. And so then he started arguing in favor of ratification with the Federalist Papers based on what they got out of the Philadelphia Convention. And then, of course, he tried to twist it within just a year or 2 years afterwards. But here he is when he was sounding good in Federalist number 33. The principle is important, even though, man, I think in my X profile, it still says Hamilton hater. But it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become supreme law of the land. So he's saying as soon as they go beyond the limits of the delegated powers, this is not federal supremacy in anything and everything they do until the federal government decides that they violated the supremacy clause. He's just saying they will not even become the supreme law of the land as soon as they try to pass it. He said these will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. And if we think about the principles of the revolution, treating them as such is to refuse to comply, to resist, and nullify. And it's not just a mere good idea. The revolutionaries viewed it as a duty. And before we get to that, first of all, back to Thomas Gordon in Cato's letter number 42. He said, the law of nature does not only allow us, but oblige us to defend ourselves. It is our duty not only to ourselves, but to the society. And then he cites Seneca the Younger, a philosopher from ancient Rome who used a very famous phrase to the revolutionaries. If we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our property and fortunes, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. Now, you might be familiar with this, maybe not. I know the government-run schools don't teach this, but I mention this phrase all the time on the show, as cited by Samuel Adams, writing in probably my favorite one of his essays. There's not as much of his stuff. He wasn't the kind of guy that was saving his stuff for posterity. But writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette in October of 1771, this was really the publishing tool of the Sons of Liberty. And he's reiterating this exact same thing. He said, "Let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom." So the viewpoint is, it's your duty to take a stand against usurpations of power. It's not just a good idea. It's not something that we ought to do or that we can do. It's something that we ought to do, because when you go along with something, as John Dickinson told us in response to the Stamp Act, if you comply with the act, you establish the detestable precedent. If government thinks it can get away with even the smallest thing, then government will get away with another small thing and another one and another one. And eventually you're going to think, oh my God, it's attacking us like, as Patrick Henry said it would happen, like an ambuscade. And all of a sudden it's got all kinds of power. And then you're wondering, how did we end up living under the largest government in history? It must just be one team or the other. And you get all types of wrong solutions to the problems. But here's how Samuel Adams put it in that same essay. He said, "The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution, are worth defending at all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks." Thomas Jefferson, writing his opinion against the constitutionality of Alexander Hamilton's First National Bank in 1791, the Bank Bill, he said, "To take a single step beyond the bounds thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to basically give them what he called a boundless field of power. So it is our duty to defend all hazards against our Constitution, all attacks on our liberty." Thomas Gordon also went all the way back to cite Cicero. And I don't know if this is, I don't know, I haven't found the source from Cicero on this, but this is in Cato's letter number 42. "He who does not resist mischief when he may is guilty of the same crime as if he had deserted his parents, his friends, and his country." And if you think about this, under the Constitution, St. George Tucker is taking the same view. It's basically a duty of people who take an oath to the Constitution to take a stand, not just kind of by talking about it, but to do something. He said, "Acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. The people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the governments, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. If you are taking an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of your state and the Constitution for the United States, you are not following your oath if you are not opposing any act of the government that goes beyond the delegated powers." That's just part of why I tell people who are good on the Constitution and liberty, oh my God, don't waste your time running for office, because every moment you're in there, you're basically violating your oath. Like, that's one of the reasons. I mean, if you're going to run, you should keep it more local, state, local level. Don't waste your time in Washington, D.C. The empire is unfixable. The only thing that can be done with it is to resist it back into its box, or, well, into a new box, however the people decide to do it. Anyway, so they are bound by oath to oppose them. He said, "For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction, by obedience or otherwise, to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government." Now, of course, the argument always goes, when we talk about stuff like this, people will say, oh my goodness, if people could just resist what they think is unconstitutional. Now, mind you, each individual, I haven't been able to find the source for this quote, but I find it on quote locations or quote sites all the time. John Locke, supposedly, if not, this is a good quote. "A single man must judge for himself whether circumstances warrant obedience or resistance to the commands of the civil magistrate." So you have to think about it in the context of what you're doing. We have so many rules, laws, regulations on the books, which shouldn't even exist. Thousands and thousands of these things on the federal level, and we're not even counting the state level, violating state constitutions. There's so many of these on the books that there's a book out there written 3 felonies a day. Basically, anyone can be picked up at any time. The likelihood that they've violated some federal act at any time is very, very high. All people. And that's because there's too much. The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws, the more corrupt the state. I'm not sure if it's the other way around, But the mentality is, or the approach is like, look, there's the real chaos is coming from government, not the people. But of course, people who support the monster state want us to believe that if individuals decide to resist or defy or disobey or evade a federal act or any government act, or if the smaller societies, the states or counties, try to resist, opt out, refuse to comply, nullify a federal act, they just tell us that this would be total anarchy, total chaos. I mean, maybe they're threatening us with a good time. But Thomas Gordon over at Cato, in his Cato letters, he said it is absolutely the opposite. Here's how he put it. It is said that the doctrine of resistance would destroy the peace of the world. But it may be more truly said that the contrary doctrine would destroy the world itself, as it has already some of the best countries in it. The enemies of peace and liberty and prosperity are the people who violate the rules given to the government. Those are the people having the problem, not the people trying to enforce things. Here's William Emerson, a sermon from 1802 in commemoration of American independence. So as we're getting close to Independence Day here, this is a real proper thing to think about. He's the father of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is pretty interesting as well. He passed away pretty young. But here's how he put it. Who is the rebel against law and order? The legislator ordaining or the citizen resisting unconstitutional measures? He said, it is the unprincipled minister who artfully innovates on the custom of governing, the ambitious senator whose self is his God, the faithless magistrate who tramples on rights which he has sworn to protect. These are the men who, by perverting the purposes of government, destroy its foundation, bring back society into a state of war, and are answerable for its mischievous effects. So those are the people who are the rebel against law and order. The people who are law and order are the people who are defying the unconstitutional acts of government, the arbitrary power, the usurpations. He said, not those who defend, but those who attack the liberties of mankind are disturbers of the public peace. And that brings me back to James Otis Jr., because we can keep hammering on his views, especially from the early part of the American Revolution, writing here as freeborn American in April of 1767. There is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. I think it's so essential to get this information out to more and more people, because most people have been, propagandized from cradle to grave that the only way to solve problems with government is to ask the government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place. But if we believe the founders, we believe the old revolutionaries, acts of usurpation deserve to be treated as acts of usurpation, defied, resisted, not complied with, however is right for you in your area, in as broad of as many people as possible. That's the only way to keep government in check. Even Lysander Spooner said this in the 1850s. He said this is the maintenance of the Constitution itself, by basically treating these usurpers and robbers as what they're supposed to be. There's absolutely nothing that helps us reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you've got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing dirty government fiat, please throw it our way. We punch way above our weight class. Your help, whether it's through smashing a like button or sharing links or supporting us financially, it all has helped us get through these first 18 years. Sometimes it has not been easy. We do a lot of work here, but we love what we do. We believe in what we do, and we want your help to be able to reach and teach more people. So please consider joining us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There's also annual 5-year and lifetime options. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. And I hope to see it. Oh, I should mention, I'm not going to have any shows during Independence Day week. I just need a little time to catch up on a few other projects, so I'm going to take a little bit of downtime and work on that as well, but I'll be back the following week. I'll have a show on Friday this week, then off all Independence Day week, and I'm going to try to get a little time to see some family as well. So I hope you have a wonderful Independence Day holiday. I hope to see you on Friday, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty.